Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I am super excited to be joined by Johnny Compton, who is a Stoker Award-nominated author whose work has appeared in renowned publications like Pseudopod, Strange Horizons, and the No Sleep podcast. He has been captivating readers and listeners with his unique take on horror. In 2023, he released his debut novel, The Spite House, and now he's here to talk about his second novel, which I might add has been called the most anticipated horror of 2024, and rightfully so. Devils Kill Devils. So I want to say welcome to the show, Johnny.
Thank you for having me on, Rick. This is a pleasure.
This book, man, I told you when you first came on, I was like, you took me on a thrill ride, and I'm super excited to sort of dive in and talk about this thing. But before we do that, I would love to get to know you a little bit. So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Love to. I'm a San Antonio-based author, San Antonio, Texas. I've been here, went to high school here, a little bit of college that I did attend. I went to college here, and I've been a big horror fan since I was a child. Before I lived in San Antonio, I lived in Mississippi. 5 years old, heard my first ghost story through my kindergarten teacher, and haven't looked back since. A lot of ghost stories circulating in Mississippi, so I was able to sustain myself on that for a while. And then San Antonio is also supposed to be the most haunted city in all of Texas, at least. And we have all kinds of wild legends here. We have an alleged werewolf that most people don't know about, but there's a suburb of San Antonio called Converse. So there's the Converse werewolf. There's Woman Hollering Creek, which was written about by Sandra Cisneros, the great Sandra Cisneros, who wrote about that, which is related to the legend of La Llorona. We have the Ghost Tracks, which was written about by my friend Celso Hurtado. We have the Donkey Lady Bridge, and many, 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 many more. I could go on. So even beyond the ghosts, we have cryptids and all kind of crazy things. And again, that's been able to sustain me and keep me as interested as I want to be in the genre, beyond just obviously all the many books and many movies that I watch.
I love that. I'm also from the South, born and raised in North Carolina, living in California now. But well, yeah, we grew up with a lot of ghost stories. I think every place probably has their own version of ghost story. But I remember from a very young age, probably 4 or 5, being fascinated by ghost stories myself.
Oh yeah, so I feel like it's a thing where, like you said, growing up in the South, different places certainly have them. Everywhere has them, but like I haven't heard too many people be like, "Oh, the famous famously haunted places in Wyoming," or something like that. There are certain places where I'm sure they have some wonderful, haunting specific stories in Wyoming, but certain places you think of it more readily as, oh, this is a source, this is a haven for ghosts and strange events.
And it's funny, I think most people associate Bigfoot with like the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. But we had Bigfoot, like that was like especially for a few years there, that was the big thing. I mean, it was like Bigfoot. So I'm curious, do you have a favorite ghost story from your childhood or a scary story from your childhood that you remember or has lived and stayed with you?
I mean, the first one that jumps in mind is the Golden Arm, which is the story that brought it. That was the one that my kindergarten teacher played for us on a record, and that's the one that awakened this sensation in me of I need to write stuff or I need to embed myself in stuff like this, and then later on I need to write it. And then there's a Robert Bloch short story that I read when I was 7 years old, thereabouts. And for anybody who doesn't know, Robert Bloch is the author of Psycho. And I'm in my mid-40s. I'm a little bit older. I grew up in the 80s. And the way things were presented, I think back then was just different. So I read it in a short story collection called Shudders, edited by a man named Ross R. Olney. And that short story collection was presented as though it was for children. And meanwhile, it's got the author of Psycho with the leadoff story. He's in leadoff position, and he wrote this story called Sweets to the Sweet. That is one of the best short stories I've ever read, and it's got this fabulously gruesome ending, and I love it to pieces. And then basically anything that was in the Alvin Schwartz kind of collective of books, which is primarily the most famous is the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series. Of course, I love those. I was obsessed with those when I was a kid. But then there's also one called In a Dark, Dark Room that's for even younger readers. And some of the stories in a dark, dark room, in a dark, dark room, I should say, I've heard people actually conflate them with being in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I happen to own both of those amidst my collection of much more adult horror, but I have all of those books still. And so I try not to correct people because nobody likes a guy who's like, but
You
it
can
is something
correct
that
me. I give you permission. You can correct me anytime you want. I got no problem with
well, it's just, it's just one of those things I take note of, I find interesting. So that's why I packaged them all as Alvin Schwartz, who's the man who collected a lot of those stories, or collected them all. And I don't think he really wrote too many original ones for it, but he did kind of embellish on some old legends here and there. But yeah, it's just, I feel like it's really fascinating that a lot of people have, as we've gotten to this, I guess, next stage of where we are generationally, people who've come out more as oh yeah, those books really impacted me and affected me. Because I remember getting to my early 20s and going through a stretch where I could hardly find anybody else who even remembered those books. And I was like, maybe this was like just more of a niche thing. And then it turns out it was like incredibly popular, and somehow I hadn't found my tribe. So it's fascinating to see how much people actually love those books and how much more recognition they're receiving now, as well they should.
Well, you've resparked a flame for me to go back and check them out again. It's been a while since I have, but now I kind of I'm like, yeah, I love that. I want to go read that. So again, all right. Well, we got to talk about this amazing book. I can't wait anymore. It's called Devils Kill Devils, and it is definitely a thrill ride for me. And I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about what the book is about, and then we'll kind of dive in.
Sure. So the book is about a young lady named Sarita Bardalis, and she has had a guardian angel all her life, and it is not a figment of her imagination or anything along those lines. It's very unambiguous. He has shown up multiple times to save her life throughout the course of her relatively youthful life. And she's about to get married to the love of her life, Frank. And then the night of her wedding, in the honeymoon suite, her guardian angel shows up and beats Frank to death right in front of her. And that's in the first chapter, so that's not exactly a spoiler. That's how things jump off. And we go from there. We find out whether or not this was indeed an angel and Frank was maybe up to something. And then we find out whether or not maybe this was not an angel. And if it wasn't an angel, then what is it? And what has it been saving her for? And we introduce some, hopefully, really compelling villains to go along with what I hope to also be a very compelling, strong, flawed, interesting protagonist, and take you on this crazy journey from San Antonio into some really dark places in the Texas Hill Country.
Well, you most certainly accomplished that mission. So
Thank you.
So yeah, that opening scene, man, that I wasn't expecting that. I read a lot of books for the show. One of the things that I love is when a novel starts out right away with the supernatural versus the buildup, right? Because sometimes the buildup comes a little later. You didn't bother to wait for that. You're like, no, we're doing it. We're doing it right now. And I just was like, I think was it page 2 when this started or something? And I just was like, holy crap, I am in. So it's great.
I'm a big fan of getting things going relatively early whenever it's appropriate, right? Every story, you take the pacing as it's appropriate. But I think with the Spite House, my first book, even there's build up to get to the supernatural, but there's not a lot of build up in terms of believing in the supernatural. There's not like the usual sequence in a haunted house story where it's like one person sees the ghost, they tell a family member who disbelieves until they see it, and then it cascades, and usually the father is the last person to accept it, and then you have to bring in the experts, yada yada. I'm not trying to disparage that formula necessarily, because I've read a lot of good stories and I've seen good movies that utilize that very effectively. It's just also something that I think, if I have an opportunity to do something a little bit against the grain, this is one way to differentiate myself. So let's get right to it. And I did it even faster, obviously, in Devils Kill Devils, right from the opening chapter.
I loved it. I love the impact that it had on me as a reader. I think that other readers will will be blown away by it as well. I mean, I love it when let's go.
Yeah.
So we talked about Sarita and her relationship with her guardian angel, Angelo. It's very complex and kind of mysterious. And I'm kind of wondering what inspired you to explore this dynamic between a protector figure, right? And one that's that we sort of assume is he's sworn to protect, but especially in such a very supernatural and what we find very weird and creepy way.
Man, great question. I think when I came up with this idea for the book, one of the things I knew I wanted to do, I've had this idea for years and years and years. And one of the things I wanted to do was make that relationship as compelling as possible. So I knew I didn't want there to be an oversimplified reason for necessarily why Angelo does what he does. And I didn't want there to be, on the flip side, an oversimplified reaction necessarily from Sarita. And Sarita obviously is hell bent on getting answers to this mystery. She's also got revenge on her mind. But as the story goes, as it progresses, there's a certain amount of guilt that she starts to feel, not just in relation to what happened to Frank, her husband, but also as the book progresses, she has to confront the idea of taking Angelo, the gift that Angelo was that saved her life, for granted. And there's a passage I write about how she never once told him thank you. And she's a little bit beaten up about the idea of, like, could that be the reason? Could he just be that petty? And as we go through the story, again, like I said, it's more complicated than that. I didn't want to oversimplify things, but it is one of those things where the idea of having a guardian angel, a divine protector, providence looking over you, this is, I know for a lot of people, there's a sort of a belief in that in some capacity or another. And what if your presumptions about what that entails? What if you're wrong? You're also dealing with something that is ultimately super mysterious. If you believe in that, it's designed to be unknowable. So what then happens if the grand overseer that you put all your faith in does something that makes you question whether or not that was the right thing? And it kind of goes to old religious stories, and there's some religious horror aspects in here as well, but old religious stories, and God asking for the child to be sacrificed as a test, I believe, of Abraham. And what if it wasn't God doing that? Was kind of one of the, I grew up in Catholic school, and there was always kind of this, oh, the story's just about this, right? This is just about putting your faith in it. And it's like, what if that wasn't even God, though? Like, what if, like, somebody's doing an impression? Like, what if some evil force is out here manipulating you? And then you get older and you hear stories about people who actually do horrible things and claim, I thought I heard the voice of God telling me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's real serial killers and other people who've done that. And then movies that have had that. There's a movie called God Told Me To, I believe it is the actual name of it. I want to say it's Italian, and I want to say it's from the 70s because that just sounds all right, but I could be wrong. So feel free, somebody, to fact check me later on.
I'm writing it down.
Please do. But it's another one where we find it's tracing this series of killings from people who seem to be under the influence of something supernatural, but they're under the mistaken belief that they're being directed by something divine. But what if it's infernal? And so then I thought, again, not wanting to make things a little bit too pat and too easy, what if there's some space in between, and we have a level of morality that we can't quite contemplate, and there are mistakes potentially being made on both sides in terms of the interpretation of what should be done and what is expected to be done. And that's what I hope people get out of the story, especially, is primarily from Sarita's perspective, but we get a little bit of what Angelo's background is as the story goes on. And I hope people are able to sympathize with kind of everything that takes place here in the midst of all the grandiose horror.
Well, you've touched on something I did want to sort of talk about, and I don't think it's a spoiler because I've seen it in the marketing materials, but this book weaves together elements of vampirism, religious occultism, and the Book of Tobit. And it actually was a very big question for me about the research that goes into it. I get so fascinated by research and, like, just sort of diving in and pulling all this together. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that research that helps you blend all of these themes into one cohesive story that really works for me. So,
oh, thank you. the research was really fun for this one. Sometimes you get caught up in research. I think that's necessary, but a little bit more tedious. Like, if you want to, stage a crime scene properly, it can be interesting, but sometimes you got to get into meticulous details and a
Right.
certain degree of research. This was like me going back and reading 18th century books from Benedictine monks about all of the different types of devils that
I love
exist, and
that.
they're writing it from the perspective of people. I mean, these are guys who believed in this wholeheartedly, and they are saying this is basically a book to say, watch out for these types of witches, watch out for these types of werewolves, watch out for these types of vampires, watch out for these types of demons and ghouls. And it's fascinating because they are listing it from different countries, and these are the identifying features, and you might run into this at a crossroads if you're not careful. And it very quickly became apparent that I was going to be wrestling with wanting to put every damn cool thing I come across into this book, and knowing you really can't do that, on top of wanting to include some kind of historical horror and other elements. So this book, there were a lot of things that got shaved off over the course of me writing it, and then even when I got to my editors, and they were like, "This is all really fascinating stuff. Also, it's not really what the story's about." Kind of getting into that, and no, I'm not here to disparage anybody's writing or anything at all, but it kind of gets into that Da Vinci Code territory a little bit, where I remember that being one of the commentaries about the Da Vinci Code. It was
Like,
like, we're stopping the story dead in its tracks to get into, like, I researched this, so I want you guys to read it because I think it's cool. And I understand that impulse now because I want it to be like, did you guys know that, but now I'm being afforded the opportunity to. I've written a writer's digest. They asked me to write something about the research that went into the book, so I get to, like, now spill the beans on some of these goofy little things. Not a
oh
ton.
my
It's
god, I
like only
love
about
it.
it's only about 1,000 words, but some of it was like, yeah, like there's legend, or their old one of their old beliefs was that a vampire could be, not born of just a bite, but so many different things. So, like, a big cat jumping across a corpse. If a big cat jumped over your still corpse, you might become a vampire. Which I was like, this is, amidst all the other crazy things I'm reading, I was like, this is hilarious to me because, what, first of all, who's deciding what is or isn't a big cat?
Yeah,
I I
exactly.
it's does it have to leap? Could it be tossed across? If somebody, like, wanted to make someone a vampire, could they coax the cat to do it? Does that still count? All these kind of bizarre things on top of the other things that were at the time, which you would think of as considered considerably more serious, like excommunication and all kinds of bizarre rituals that could take place as far as what will or won't create these various types of monsters, and witchcraft, and all these different things that they were wholeheartedly in complete terror of, while also thinking we have to remain vigilant because if somebody's doing this, they might end up becoming a creature of the night.
Well, talking about faith, I want to talk a little bit about Sarita's faith and the faith of those around her. I feel like for me, it played a very significant role in the novel, not only from her as a child and first learning about her guardian angel and her mother naming, I think it was her mother that named
Mhm.
him Angelo, and but also I just like the significant role of it overall in the story. I'm curious more about exploring the intersection of belief and skepticism and supernatural intervention when all of those things sort of come together. So
Yeah, it was fun to write about. It was fun to examine and explore.
I would
Um,
think it would be. I was like, that's what's fascinating to me. Is like you really get a chance to just dig in and dissect it and have fun with it.
I mean, truly, and like I mentioned, I went to Catholic school, but I didn't grow up Catholic. That was just the private school availability, basically in 80s Mississippi. And my mom wanted me to go to a private school because I have older brothers who I love them to pieces, but they got to have all the fun trouble that kind of ruined it for me. Like, by the time I was ready to go to high school, my mom was like, no, even elementary
Same,
school, she was like, no, no, no,
same.
we need to pump the brakes. I know what
Yeah,
you
we've been
boys get
through
up to.
this. You're not doing
Yes,
it.
exactly, exactly. So I saw that perspective, though. I was embedded in that perspective, and then my own upbringing in a more Protestant household, and then my own belief systems, kind of my own faith in what I believe in the world, kind of altering and reforming in different ways as I got older. And then being able to put that into these characters and put that into how Sarita sees things, especially as someone who has proof of what she believes is the divine, but absolutely is the supernatural. And she's been witness to it several different times. So on one hand, it's easier to believe, but on the other hand, the mystery is even more pronounced for her in a certain way because nothing is ever explained to her. And it would just be, I feel like it kind of ties back to old legends and myths, even about when you witness a natural phenomenon and you have no way to explain it, and you read old or listen to old legends and read old stories about people seeing like a tornado, and it's, the finger of God. And it's what else would you think of if you had no concept of the
Right.
climate and meteorology and any of this? And it's just like every once in a while, the clouds that we always see in the sky, this is where they belong. They start to spin, and a funnel of cloud descends and wreaks havoc on Earth. You would absolutely just think, well, this is something, some level of God has pinpointed
Mhm.
this area and wants to destroy it. And if you happen to be in the path, it might be about wanting to destroy you too. How could you not believe in something like that? So having that element of it, but then being able to put it in this 21st century mindset of, well, there needs to be a deeper knowledge and explanation for things, and having to juggle, like you say, the skepticism. Her brother is never fully trusting, and part of that is his own ego. And then it's, well, you're distrustful, and you maybe get proven to be right, but you can be right but inaccurate in a simultaneous way sometimes, where, well, I guessed that this was going to happen, but I didn't really know. I didn't base that on any firm information. It's just really gut instinct or even just biases. And so being able to evaluate all of that, and then, the cherry on top of the Sunday for me personally was my biggest villain in the story, Sella, being able to manipulate people, manipulate the masses that she wants to manipulate by turning
And does
people.
she?
Oh yes. And,
And
and,
does she?
and she, to a degree that she can't even control it at a certain
Mhm.
extent. And I thought that was fascinating because she is this centuries old vampire, and she has an objective, and she wants to try to mobilize a force of vampires to do something horrible. And she figures the best way to do this is to take a page from these humans, these things that she kind of looks down upon, this thing she used to be. But she's like, whenever they've needed to mass mobilize and destroy people, religion has been a pretty effective way to do it. And exploiting the faith you might have in something, in a higher power and a greater calling, has been a great way to do it. And she's walked the earth a long time, and she was there for the Crusades, and she was there for every world war and things preceding the world wars. So she's taken notes, and she's very aware of the power of faith whenever you want to use it against people. So that part was very, very interesting and fun to write as well.
She's a scary, scary, scary nemesis. Let me tell you that.
Thank you. Oh, I mean, like, she was so much fun as
I
a
bet.
character to develop. God, she was good.
So my next question, I'm going to try and blend two of my questions together because I feel like they might kind of coincide. One of the themes that really kind of stood out to me here is the exploration of survivor's guilt. And it's something you
Mm.
touched on earlier too, as well. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that theme influences the characters in the story as a whole. But for the other part of my question, which was a separate question, how it also applies to Sarita and her journey, not only personally, but in the supernatural world as well. I don't know if
Oh,
that
yeah.
makes sense, but that's kind of sort of
Absolutely.
like, yeah. So,
Sure, sure. No, like, I think as a whole, for a lot of the characters, we have multiple moments. There's a moment with a character who turned out to be one of my favorites, and I'm not going to name him because I feel like that would be spoiling a little bit much for what this is going to reference. But and this is going to be I'm guessing that most horror authors don't come on and reference the never-ending story. I'm guessing, I'm
I
presuming.
can say you'd be the first.
And if anybody's never seen it, I grew up on this movie, loved it, and it's a cherished movie from the '80s, and is a classic example of one of those things that we grew up watching in the '80s. That was also emotionally scarring because there are several just devastating, horrific moments that you wouldn't expect from a children's movie, and I don't think they would put those in most children's movies these days. There's a character in that movie called the Rock Biter, and he's just this silly, goofy, giant puppet. And he's this big, strong thing made like it's like a human mountain hybrid. And there's this speaking of tornadoes, kind of like this gigantic storm of nothingness called the Nothing that is the major nemesis of that book. And it sucks existence into this black hole, basically. And he is encountered, this, I guess, is a spoiler for this decades old movie. He's encountered by the hero at some point after a previous encounter where the rockbiter had several friends with him. And now it's just the rockbiter by himself. And he's too large to have been sucked up. But he's describing his hands, and he's looking at his hands, and he says they look like good, strong hands, don't they? And then he describes how the Nothing came by and he tried to hold on to his friends, but it was too strong and it sucked them up. And he's sitting here with this survivor's guilt. And I mean, I was like 8 years old or something when I saw this, and that has lived with me ever since. And to the extent that I have my own version of that, I've been wanting to write my own version of that scene, and I have it at a certain point in the book where a character is basically looking at his hands and feeling useless. And there's a lot of sense of within, kind of that's a lot of different characters have a moment like that in the book, like you said, overall. And then specific to Sarita and her family, even the hand aspect is repeatedly the motif of the strong hands is it comes up time and time again, where Angela, the first time Angelo has to save her is because she was going to drown because her and her brother were playing in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Surprise wave knocks them both down into the water. Sarita gets swept away and her brother was holding her hand and couldn't hold on. And he's a kid, she's a kid, so he's not to blame. And yet his guilt is a driving force for what he does and what he becomes throughout the course of the story. And Sarita having
his profession as well, right? I feel
yes.
So
he becomes a Coast Guard rescue diver because he feels like he's making amends. This is like the torment of his entire life. And for Sarita, she's trying to at once assuage him of this guilt and let him know you were just a kid, basically in her own ways. And on the other hand, though, she's dealing with the same thing where that opening scene is her guardian angel beating the love of her life to death. And she tried to fight back and save him. And of course was powerless against this supernatural creature. But she feels various forms of guilt about that as the story progresses. What more could she have done? Should she have told him sooner? If she told him sooner, would he have thought she was insane and not married her, and that saves his life? And would that have been worth it? She has to grapple with all these things. That survivor's guilt exists for her, for side characters. There's an entire group of side characters who are dealing with their own survivor's guilt from one of my favorite scenes that I've ever written in anything. I've written a lot of short stories. I've written 2 books now. The tunnel scene, I'll just leave it at that.
With
that
Myra.
was, oh yeah, that was an absolute blast. Yep. And I mean, if people are going to read that and think I'm psychotic because I do some horrible things to people in that scene.
It's part of an upcoming question I have for you. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Let me not step on that then. I apologize. I'm a talker, man. I'll go. So stop me before I get ahead of myself.
No, this is what we call, peppering it in and setting it up so that we can come back to it later. I love it. It's great. So I think overall, for me, this book has moments of both not only psychological horror, but it's got supernatural horror. And like I said, you really took me on a ride with this book. You touched on all these things that I absolutely love. I feel like you talk about the tunnel scene, which was a really favorite scene, but I think my all-time favorite moment in the story is something you did. In my opinion, it's masterful, and it's masterful not only in the pacing of it, but the length of it, how it went on a little longer than you'd like it to, but it served a purpose for me because it's not over yet. You're not off this ride yet. This ride is still going. And it's when they all meet up in the Lantern Cafe, it's about halfway through the book. And for me, I think that's a major turning point in the story. And so, like I said, I was hooked from the beginning, but I just was like, my God, this chapter is just not ending. It just keeps going. And but you kept the tension up. And it was through the roof, and I just loved it. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about writing not only that section. We don't have to get into spoilers, obviously, because like I said, it feels like, to me, in my opinion, it's a major turning point in the story for all the characters. But I want to talk about sort of the process of writing that, right? Like how you maintain that tension and you keep heightening it with each paragraph, it felt like.
Man, I'm so glad you like that scene Thanks for highlighting that one. And the escalation of it, I mean, I'm gonna have to rein myself in because this is one of my favorite
Well,
things
we're
to
not
talk
live,
about.
so I can edit anything
Okay,
that you
okay,
edit.
good.
Just tell me if
It's
you
just
want it out, and I'll take it out. So.
it's just one of my favorite things to talk about is the idea of, like you said, heightening the tension. So many of my favorite stories, and so many of the stories that I try to emulate, and storytellers that I admire so much, figure out a way to take a bad situation and keep seemingly making it worse, and it just
That's
piles up
exactly
and
it.
piles up and piles up. So my favorite horror movie is Alien. I've probably mentioned that a few different times if anybody's heard me on different podcasts and interviews or what have you. But I
Mine
just
too.
can't.
So you're
Oh,
right. We're right
there
there.
you go. And it's the beauty of it that I love throughout the entire movie. Things keep getting worse, and they start off pretty bad. And I
Mm-hmm.
like my point of comparison is something like Halloween, which I absolutely love to pieces. It's obviously a masterpiece. It created an entire genre, essentially, not literally, but for all intents and purposes. It created the slasher genre as we know it modernized. But it pretty much is escaped maniac on the loose, terrorizing teenagers. That is the tension, and it never like rises above that. Now it doesn't
Right.
have to. That's not the kind of story it's trying to tell. So like that's not a knock against it. It's just that's the lane it's in. And I feel like that's the same for a lot of different stories. Alien, it's face hugger, and okay, is that the alien itself? Not quite. Then it dies, but in the course of it, you find out it has acid for blood. So okay, that's we also have to contend with that. Then is this chest burster going to be the alien? We have to deal with this little strange, another little critter. No, it's actually going to grow. And so we have to contend with that. By the way, one of your team members is working for the bad guys, and those bad guys are your employers, and you've been set up, and this was a setup from the beginning. So you have to contend with that. All the way up to I rewatched it in the theater recently. I'd never seen it in the theater. I've seen it so many millions, not literally, but millions of times on the small screen. It came back to theaters this summer. I went and watched it. And I was really just, for the first time, somehow, it never really occurred to me how ridiculous these self destruct mechanisms are in the Nostromo. Like, to get it started, it makes sense. You have to go through several steps. And that totally makes sense. You want to make sure that are you sure about doing this self-destruct sequence? Undoing it though should be pretty simple. Like if that should be like a button, deactivate. So instead of having to reverse every step of the self-destruct sequence, then during the self-destruct sequence, as it's still counting on, as Mother is still counting down, it's already blasting fireballs into the hallway. You're
So
still on
your ship,
10.
your
You're
ship is
still
already
10,
destroyed.
9. I'm like, what if I'm just slow? This is not supposed to destruct until 0. What are you doing? So you have to contend with that on top of the alien presence that is still there. Things just keep getting worse in that movie. I love it so much. And so writing a scene like that, I try to, do a compact version of it basically where it's a little bit of the Raymond Chandler, I think it's Raymond Chandler, the adage to just have a guy walk into a room with a gun. Like that kind of never fails as a storytelling adage. It's not literally a guy walking into a room with a gun, but it is a guy walking into a room or into, in this case, a restaurant, and things start getting progressively worse. And he starts revealing more and more about himself, more and more about Sarita. She finds out things about herself. Some people that are there that shouldn't be start finding out why they shouldn't be there and finding out that they're going to be casualties, and it just keeps going from there. And there's so much, it kind of has almost a old west
That's
potential
exactly what I
standoff.
was feeling.
Oh,
That was
I'm so
exactly
glad
what I
you
was
picked up
feeling.
on that. Yeah, it's there are basically 4, I think, different parties involved,
Mm-hmm.
different people,
And
and
it,
it's like they've all come to the same saloon,
and it
and
just
it's
keeps building.
yeah.
It's like it's crazy because you think, okay, this is going to happen. Nope, that's not going to happen. This is now going to happen.
Yes.
It's just the
And
it
people are
like you said, it
forming
just levels up.
alliances
Yep,
unexpectedly, but who do
yep,
you trust? And oh, that was a lot of fun to write.
yeah. Lots of levels in that. I absolutely loved it. So that'll be a perfect segue into my next question without giving anything away. Obviously, spoiler free. there a pivotal moment scene from the book that you feel readers should look forward to? That is 1000% one of mine. Also, the tunnel. So the tunnel was a great one for me. But is there a favorite one for you? Is it the tunnel?
Trying to think. I mean, there were the hospital. The hospital scene. Almost use a different term. I'll say it. The hospital massacre was a lot of fun for me as well. That was a little bit of a showstopper for me as well. I mean, it was.
I mean, you had
I
a
wrote
lot
that.
in here, man. I gotta say,
There are multiple massacre scenes. You know,
Yep.
it was so different from the Spite House, and I'm a little bit anxious about the Spite House, which I love to pieces and changed my life. Is also a much more subdued horror story, very low body count. This has a much higher body count, a much higher body count, and so it's interesting, the hospital scene, because I get to go full on with the actual creature, the style of creature I wanted to write, the style of vampire in its ugliest form, and the villain in that moment is fully embracing a level of just cruelty and pettiness and meanness that is just as disgusting as their outward appearance. And they're doing things. There's a particular specific detail about something they do after they kill one person. I'm not going to give it away, but it's when I thought of it in the moment as I was writing it, I was like, that is one of the simplest things I could have thought of in that moment, and it's also one of the grossest things I could imagine seeing something do. And it's, I don't want to make it sound like it's a gross out horror, because it's like a sentence, and it's literally
It's
as
not
they're
a gross
passing
out
by.
horror, so I'll back you up on
No,
that.
but
Not at all. It's an absolute
also
thrill ride.
in that moment. I just want you to feel like, oh, this individual is so far gone. And I took inspiration for that scene from the classic massacre in the police station in the film Terminator, the first Terminator film. And Arnold says, "I'll be back," and then just slaughters this entire police station. And so I was thinking, I had that in mind in the moment, but then I had to tailor it to the type of monster I'd created. And that comes pretty late in the book, but when it does show up, I feel like that one's a killer. But it's hard for me to choose, because I do love the tunnel scene as well. I love it to pieces.
Yeah, great stuff. So you actually did just answer one of my questions here about comparing the writing Devils Kill Devils versus Spite House. What were the differences between the two? And I think you've summarized it beautifully. So I'll just say you've answered that question. All right. So I gotta ask, what is next in line for Sarita? What's going to happen? I feel like you've set her up for a sequel. If you can confirm or deny, or neither confirm nor deny. I don't know what you can talk about, but what are you working on now? So.
Well, what I'm working on now would not be a sequel directly to Devils Kill Devils, but I will say I already, if I was given the green light to do so, I already have a title for the sequel even in mind, and I have a general idea of the direction. But to write the kind of follow up I would like to write, it would demand I wait probably a few years before I come back to it. And because I think these characters in the aftermath of this are going to need some time to breathe and develop in different ways. And I want you to be able to catch up to what have they been up to and what's going to happen next, and kind of a big cataclysmic, maybe additional showdown. But in the meantime, I don't have any plans to revisit this universe necessarily within the next, if I'm lucky enough to sell 3 or 4 more books, who knows, within that time range. But down the road, I'd love to come back to this, because again, I have the sequel and everything in mind. And if they give me the chance to write the title that I want to write, and if this book finds the audience that I can only pray that it finds, the title alone, I hope, would be terrifying. I'm going to tell you offline, so you're going to have to keep.
Yes, I was going to say, I'm going to make you tell me once we stop recording.
Yes,
right?
Yes. I'm going to tell you offline here, so you'll be one of the only people who knows this, and one of my editors who I brought this up to already. In the meantime, I've got a third book that I'm working on right now. It's I've written my ghost story book. I've now written my vampires and demons book, and this third book will be my witchcraft book.
Oh, I was hoping you'd say that. That's awesome.
I'm hoping to get into some witchcraft and other things in this third book, and if things go well, then I can write according to my master plan that I've had in my imagination for years and years. Then my fourth book will be my serial killer / urban legend book, And that's my game plan. We'll see how it goes.
Well, you've got a new fan. I will definitely keep an eye out and keep an eye on things, and let me know when I need to come online and start a petition for the sequel. I'm happy to lead that charge.
Will do.
All right. So the book is called Devils Kill Devils. It's available everywhere on September 24th. And as we always like to say here, please support your local bookstores whenever possible. So, Johnny, how can our audience find you on social media?
Social media at Compton Writes, my last name, Writes. That's basically every social media account I have. I don't use many of them that often, but I am pretty frequently on Instagram. So if there's one place you want to find me, that's it.
Sweet. I will add those to the show notes, and I'll also put them on screen as well. So, Johnny, thank you so much for talking to me today. I appreciate you being here. I'm ready to wrap this up so I can find out the title for the sequel. I'm kidding. But I do appreciate you coming on and spending some time with me today. I love this book a lot. So, like I said, it's a thrill ride. So go get it. You're not going to be disappointed. All right, you guys. We'll see you guys next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, guys. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.